I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions because I assume that you all know who you're here to, who you have arrived to hear, and we're running a little late. But Mark has recently joined the Atlantic Council, and after a career in the administration, where he was in the USTR and was dealing with South Asian affairs. Before that was in the section, I think, that dealt with multilateral organizations, the WTO. And so he brings two different perspectives to this discussion. And Manish, of course, is an old friend of ORF and also a former minister. And I'm going to I'm going to ask him now to sort of just introduce the subject for us.
I think that works. Good afternoon, Mir. Good afternoon, Mark, my colleague, Dr. Bharat Gopalaswamy. Ladies and gentlemen, not exactly the best day to assess India-US trade relations. We seem to be on an escalatory spiral as we speak. But be that as it may, the work of academia should really go on. So, Mark, on behalf of both the Observer Research Foundation and the Atlantic Council, may I welcome you. I've had the privilege and the honor of serving in the Observer Research Foundation as a distinguished fellow for almost 8 to 10 years before I moved to government. And now I have the privilege of serving in the Atlantic Council. And we also have Mir, a fairly other symbiotic connect because one of your colleagues, Maya Mir Chandani, serves both in the Observer Research Foundation and the Atlantic Council concurrently. So I think this partnership that we've begun between the Council and the Observer Research Foundation will fructify into a much deeper and a more profound relationship. The trade relationship between India and the United States has grown fairly exceptionally over the past 15 years, so as to speak. I'm not the numbers guy, but what Mihir and Bharat were telling me that from $25 billion in 2003, 2004, it stands at about $140 billion today, and has greater potential for growing even more phenomenally by leaps and bounds. So I am not going to monopolize much of your time, except to say that there is the goods and services arena, which is the traditional arena of trade between any two nations. And then there is a new dynamic which has got injected into the entire Indo-US equation, which is the data dynamic. And if data is the future oil, though I disagree with that characterization, I think some of the issues around data need to be very carefully thought through and resolved between India and the United States. So, therefore, as a part of my work in government was also to look at the virtual civilization or the internet. The fact is that we have three models as we currently speak. There is the US model, and the US pioneered the entire genesis of the internet and its exponential and innovative growth. And today you have a situation whereby the big five in the US actually control 90% of the traffic in the virtual civilization. And there have been certain concerns and issues around it. The second, of course, is the initiative which the Europeans have taken with their data protection law, trying to put a legal architecture in place whereby the protection of data, especially from a citizen standpoint becomes all the more robust. And then you have the Chinese model, whereby the Chinese have effectively firewalled the internet and turned it into a great intranet, whereby they not only have monopoly over their data, but essentially are also able to control the ingress and the egress of information. And so, therefore, as we debate our own data protection paradigms, these are three models that India would look at very carefully. And obviously, the Chinese model is not something which finds great favor, because I do not think anything is going to be gained by trying to wall off India or Indians from accessing. Accessing data globally. But there is a strong case for data localization. And the case has been made by one of the more preeminent business persons in this country. And I think as we go forth, how do we find a modus vivendi whereby the desire among certain Indian corporates, or even within the Indian establishment, that there should be some amount of data localization can really be juxtaposed with what is the prevailing dynamic, and of course a pushback from a large number of international players or multinational players that the well, the internet is a part of the global commons, and therefore we should leave it kind of open. And I think that's really is going to be the debate of the future. So with those words, Mir, I hand it back to you, and I hope we have a very fruitful and enriching discussion. I'm afraid I'll have to leave you after a while, because we seem to be in an evolving situation as we speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Manish, and thank you for taking the time out on a day of alarms and excursions to be with us. Mark, the way that I thought we'd do this is that perhaps you'd like to speak very briefly for a few minutes, as long as you feel comfortable, laying out the situation as you see it, and then maybe we'll have a quick discussion and then I'll throw it open. So, would you like to sort of start?
Of course. Thank you much to both you, Manish and Mihir, and to the entire group assembled here. We appreciate the efforts of ORF to organize this event during my short visit here to Delhi. It's truly a pleasure to be here. Over the last 2 years, in fact, I've been coming to Delhi quite a bit, and that has been in my capacity, my former capacity, as the Assistant USTR for South and Central Asia. That was in fact, my last assignment after a very long trade career. I was 33 years in the U.S. government doing trade, seven of those at the Commerce Department, and 26 of those at USTR. In fact, 6 of those at USTR in Geneva at our diplomatic mission to the World Trade Organization. And for me, that last assignment was truly one of the best. It was always interesting. It was always challenging, at times frustrating, a few times exhilarating. But now I wear a different hat. I left USTR at the end of November of last year. Brought recruited me. He made a very compelling case, just as at the moment in which I was looking to retire from USTR. So it's a real pleasure now to be here in Delhi with the Atlantic Council and working with our partners on the project we have initiated. That's the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum. These certainly are challenging times in many respects. That's definitely the case in the area of trade. I'm sure there's been much attention to ongoing negotiations between the United States and China on trade. It's certainly been seizing all the headlines back in Washington in recent weeks with my former boss, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, leading negotiations on the U.S. side. You look to the WTO, and there's a lot of soul searching there in terms of where does the multilateral trading system go? What is the perspective of the United States with respect to the WTO? Because it is significantly different than was true in previous administrations. Looking to U.S.-India trade, in fact, that is a growth sector, as Manish pointed out at the start. It's generally a positive story. Trade has been increasing on an annual basis at a rapid rate. It's now approaching roughly $150 billion of trade a year. That covers both goods and services. And the deficit, in fact, it was growing. Its recent trend is decreasing. And with respect to the Trump administration, that's a good thing, because that administration has had some focus on the deficit issue. So generally, I think things are looking quite good for the relationship on trade. That said, though, there are challenges, and the negotiation I was leading for USTR over the last year or so, specifically related to our efforts, the U.S. efforts to resolve some of the problems, so-called irritants. I don't like that word because it suggests that it's it's like an infestation, or something that is not so meaningful. But that seems to be the popular term for referring to a lot of trade problems. So I guess I will use it as well. But the GSP review that the U.S. initiated last April to look to whether India meets the criteria under the U.S. statute for preferential tariff benefits. This review essentially initiated a negotiation between the United States and India. And during the course of that negotiation over the last year, frankly, a lot of progress has been made. I think it's unprecedented that the two sides have got together like this and in a very intensive way worked to solve problems, to put important proposals on the table. It's a limited package that's been under discussion. This isn't anywhere close to an FTA, a free trade agreement negotiation. But that said, it's unprecedented in the bilateral relationship. I'm not a betting man, and if I were one, I certainly wouldn't bet on whether or not there's going to be an agreement in the near future, and whether there can be a situation in which a suspension of GSP benefits for India is avoided. I certainly hope that's the case. I hope there can be an agreement. I certainly don't think a suspension is the ideal scenario, and in many respects it would be a setback. It would impact the possibility of continuing negotiations at a very sensitive time. So I hope that can be avoided, but it seems to be day by day. In fact, I just came from the Ministry of Commerce, and I was given some reason for optimism, but I'm not the negotiator anymore, and I haven't seen the proposal, so it's really tough to say. There is one area beyond what's been under negotiation over the last year, which is potentially a new source of tension between the two countries related to trade, and that's with the e-commerce policy that was just issued by DIPP, now rechristened DPIIT. It's an important document. From what I understand, it's one that deserves a lot of attention and should prompt analysis and commentary and hopefully dialogue, because it's a draft policy. It's not a final one, and I expect that there's the opportunity to shape it a bit going forward. I'm not sure how that plays out in terms of the election and beyond, but we certainly, in some of my conversations with industry, there have been some concerns raised, for example, with data localization requirements, and the reflection of what DIPP issued in a press note about a month ago with respect to restrictions on electronic platforms. Hopefully the two sides, and ideally, in fact, stakeholders without the two sides needing to engage a lot, can resolve some of the concerns that have arisen, and there's not a future situation in which there's a new negotiation between the United States and India with the threat of some kind of action being taken by the United States. But I think everyone is aware that this Trump administration has been very aggressive on the trade front. I worked for a lot of different presidents, a lot of different USTRs, and this one was definitely unique, and for me in many respects. I got lots of insights working the last 2 years of my government career at USTR under this administration. In some respects, I think they still are learning as they go along in terms of how far you can take that kind of an aggressive approach and actually accomplish outcomes. Because ultimately, that's what trade negotiations should be all about. It's with the objective of reaching outcomes, whether it's multilateral, whether it's bilateral, whether it's through a free trade agreement negotiation. And hopefully someday there might be circumstances in which the U.S. and India could look at initiating a free trade agreement negotiation. So with that, those are my immediate insights. I'm outside now, and I feel like I can be a bit more frank in expressing my views within reason. But I look forward to participating in the conversation.
So let me try and maybe, I won't say push you, but inquire further into a couple of these points. One in particular, is it a serious, to what degree is the concern that India will no longer have access to the generalized system of preferences? To what degree is it born out of recent additional irritants, to use the word that neither of us likes? And to what degree is it simply a consequence of a belief in DC that India has grown too large to benefit from these? Because I think that maybe we're not being able to separate those two instincts.
That's a real U.S. GSP program and whether it should be reformed in important respects. Other major developed countries have reformed their GSP systems. The European Union did so in a substantial way some years ago. Canada reformed their GSP program some years ago, and as a result, you know, there were consequences for India in terms of the you know, the new considerations that were brought into those programs. So that's not a new issue, and I think it's really important that you highlighted it, because that can get lost in specific circumstances. And you know, there have been questions in the past, and I think currently, about the value of a GSP program for a large developing country, and particularly in circumstances in which multilateral negotiations on tariffs have gone nowhere and are going nowhere for the foreseeable future. And might a GSP program be one of the contributing factors to the failure to negotiate on tariffs multilaterally? But certainly the review that was initiated in April with respect to India was tied to some very specific challenges that the U.S. side was seeking to resolve. And the context was a bit different too, because the Trump administration did introduce a new approach to GSP in terms of, on an annual basis, reviewing all beneficiaries to see whether they meet the criteria, although on a 3-year cycle. And the first year focused on the Asian beneficiaries. So that's new, and in fact was a motivation for the review that was initiated in April. There were 2 specific irritants that were identified, had been identified through petitions, and that's medical devices and dairy. But more broadly, the administration self-initiated across a market access criterion that's in the U.S.
And
statute.
just to follow up on that, the medical devices, we know, our assumption is that we're talking about quantitative, about the various sort of restrictions placed on imported, on the pricing of imported stents. In dairy, was there anything new, or was it just like a generally closed market?
A generally closed market, but it's a generally closed market with respect to U.S. production, not with respect to imports from other countries. And this relates to how cattle are raised in the United States, which is different from many other countries. And I think the negotiators, I know when I was working on this, have been aware of the sensitivities of this issue, and you know, the arguments that India has made for the restrictions it has in place, and whether there could be an approach devised that would fully respect those concerns.
Right. Let's move to the steel and aluminum tariffs that the U.S. imposed, which was 25% on steel and 10%, I think it was, on aluminum. And shortly after those were imposed, I think we announced retaliatory tariffs in India on specific U.S. goods, but we have not implemented them yet, which I assume means that there is hope, there continues to be hope, at least in India, that the steel and aluminum tariffs will be, if not lifted, then there's light at the end of that tunnel. To what extent is there light at the end of that tunnel?
Well, that gets to the point I noted at the start about not being a betting man, and certainly not one who would bet on whether there will be an outcome or not. In fact, has been on the agenda for the negotiations that have been underway.
But it's not just us. I mean, those are more general. I mean, I know that Canada is saying that it won't sign the whatever the new NAFTA is called.
USMCA.
Yes.
Let's call it NAFTA 2.
NAFTA 2.
Yeah.
Yes. Won't sign NAFTA 2 until the tariffs, until there's been some progress on the tariffs. I believe they've said that on the record. Yeah. So I'm assuming that there is some sense in DC now that maybe the tariffs served their purpose as an initial volley, and they can be reviewed.
It's on a country.
It's on a
country basis. So there have been some waivers. There were some waivers right from the start. For example, with Australia and Korea was subsequent, and I certainly hope that there's a possibility with respect to India, but I think it's really only in the context of there being a deal agreed as part of the GSP review, the negotiations that have been underway.
Right. Okay, now, so I'm going to sort of ask maybe a slightly larger question. It's one that several of us have been asking here. We do have a trade surplus from our point of view with the United States, but it's really quite tiny. It's $22 billion. 22 billion out of $75 billion in merchandise trade. And one would assume that for a developing country and a developed country of our size, 20 to 22 billion is not necessarily an enormous surplus. It's definitely worth asking why, I mean, from our point of view, why it is that we would see, and I don't want to limit it to this administration because I'm asking a larger question here, why there's concern about Indian trade practices, Indian surpluses, when of course, from both our points of view, there's a much larger gorilla in the room, or smashing its way about the world trading system, and one which has a larger surplus both with us and with the United States, and further, because from a broader strategic point of view. Trade continues to be what holds back Indo-US cooperation across a large set of things. And the reason that I don't want to limit this to the Trump administration is because even a few years ago, you would have people like the National Union of Manufacturers or something going up on the Hill and saying that India has particularly discriminatory and problematic trade practices. When, to tell you the truth, we don't really have a manufacturing sector at all, and definitely not one that is large enough or efficient enough or productive enough to threaten US manufacturing, let alone anyone else. So it's kind of puzzling to us when we see this kind of assumption that India is a problem in the trading world, when from our point of view, it isn't necessarily. It's definitely not as large enough a trader or a manufacturing power for any of those things to be true.
Yeah, well, you might want to spend a little more time with U.S. companies here and some of those stakeholders back in the United States, because certainly there's a perception in individual sectors of specific problems and challenges. And there are challenges in the U.S. market, and there's certainly Indian companies and other companies who raise market access issues with respect to the U.S. And that's what trade officials do, trade negotiators do. They try to solve problems, and they look for leverage where they can find it, ideally within reason. So there's been a debate. It's not a very academic one right now about whether trade deficits matter. It certainly was never been a preoccupation for me in my career. The focus has traditionally been on solving problems, and there are many who would argue trade deficits don't matter. The one exception that both countries seem to share is with respect to that big other country, where each country, the government of each country has expressed a lot of concern about their respective deficits with that country. So, from my perspective, and particularly now as a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, everything should be done by both sides to make the trade story a very positive one bilaterally and find ways to accomplish that. Have better engagement over time. Have new approaches and creativity brought to solving problems, and ideally being in a situation someday in which there might even be a more comprehensive negotiation, a free trade agreement negotiation.
In some sense, what I think that I was trying to get at with this was, while we can agree, and I think that most in India would say, yes, we're not a small developing country of the sort that the GSP is meant to help anymore. From a point of view of manufacturing, of our manufacturing sector, the manufacturing sector in India is small, stopped growing as a proportion of the GDP back in the middle of the 1990s. It's not just relatively small, it's relatively inefficient. It is, with the exception of certain sectors, maybe auto components, it's not competitive globally. And if somebody in India were to make the claim, if a future government was to make the claim that, look, I recognize we're not a small country or in many ways anymore, but this particular subsection of the economy, namely manufacturing, still needs the kind of sort of protection that is typically given to small developing economies. That argument would not fly, is what in DC, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, it depends on there are any kind of varieties of policies that can be put into place to help the manufacturing sector, and I think specifically in developing countries to do that. There certainly are many economists who would argue that protectionist policies do not really achieve the desired outcome in terms of development and making a manufacturing sector more efficient. But
they'd be right, but I mean, just
from a negotiator standpoint, there's only so much you can tackle in terms of addressing protectionism in other countries. So a trade policy team needs to be focused on the big problems and not necessarily the smaller problems. And certainly there's protectionism in the United States as well. I don't think it's to the degree that's here, but we are at a very different stage of development and have a different history. So protectionism is there can be circumstances when it might be justified. Often it's used as a way to satisfy certain very loud constituents, particularly in a democracy. And in those circumstances, it's probably not as defensible.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's briefly look at sort of two of the traditional issues that have been a problem one way or the other. The first is, work permits, visas, however one should call them. That, I think there has been considerable movement from the US side in the past couple of years. It's become tougher. It hasn't become necessarily as tough as many in India were expecting when this administration took office. But to what degree do you feel that this is an issue that is going to go away with time from the US side? And to what degree is it one that, because I assume that from the Indian side, a lot of the larger companies that used to demand these visas are in the process of changing their own business models for structural reasons to do with the customers that they serve. So there will be less pressure going forward. But to what degree will there be a change in the politics from the U.S. side that we should keep an eye on? Is this a new normal? A tougher H-1B
I don't,
process? A
I'm,
tough. I mean, to give you some sense, I can't see another administration coming in and loosening it.
it's hard to say, and I'm no immigration expert. Certainly, in my work with India over the years, bilaterally most recently, multilaterally in the past, it's been a perennial issue. I mean, Indian nationals have benefited quite substantially from the U.S. H-1B program. And I think the U.S. has benefited substantially from the Indian nationals' involvement in the program. Whether it's a new normal or not, immigration policy in most countries now, and certainly in the United States, is highly controversial. And this administration clearly has taken a very aggressive approach across the board. And some might question whether it makes sense in this particular area. If there is a perceived problem, is this truly the problem? If there is a problem, so it's hard to say. Many democracies are grappling with this issue a lot.
But as you correctly point out, there's a difference between the rhetorical question about what migration is a problem within quotes, and the fact of higher end, higher skilled migration, which actually speaking, even the people who worry about migration generally seem to agree is not a problem. So yet there seems to be a slightly sort of bit of confusion there. The other point that I think we've seen has been a constant problem of the past, at least the past 5 to 7 years, is India's food security stuff. And when you were at the WTO desk, you must have that must have been crossing it all the time. Now, as you no doubt know, it's very difficult for an Indian government to withdraw its its purchases of wheat and rice as being it's a pillar of not just food security, but actually income security for farmers in India. And parenthetically, we didn't do it ourselves. It was not just I wouldn't say imposed on us, but it was very strongly suggested to us by the U.S. in the late 1960s. Yeah. So when we shifted from a different form, from no income support for farmers to guaranteed purchases, the LBJ administration. But the argument here is that if India shifts away from supporting its farmers through guaranteed purchases to income security, it's going to take a long time. And I think you can see from the politics and from the policy in India that it is happening. It's happening slowly. It was just announced, income support reform was just for farmers was just announced for the first time. It is a shared assumption on both major political parties going into this current election that there will be some form of income support going forward. But it will have to reach an affordable level soon enough that it can, at a certain point, in such a way that then you can remove guaranteed purchases of wheat and rice. It's not on the horizon. It's maybe 5, maybe 7 years, hopefully. Does that mean that the WTO is essentially going to have to struggle with this problem over and over again until we sort it out? Is there no sort of exemption planned?
You ask all the hard questions. In fact, I've during my few years working specifically on India and multilaterally, I've talked to economists, even one just the other day here in Delhi, and seen reports from various think tanks on Indian support policies and how well they work and whether there should be better approaches. And you know, with these recent developments, I think a central question is that the beginning of a pivot towards that kind of approach to farm incomes. It has been controversial in the WTO. There have been efforts by WTO members to address it somewhat indirectly. You know, I was with Ambassador Froman and Michael Punk, the author of The Revenant, in Bali in 2013, in which there was a very intense negotiation, largely between, even though it was a multilateral conference, it was largely a negotiation between the United States and India, brokered by Roberto Acevedo, who's the Director General of WTO. He engaged in serious shuttle diplomacy, and as a result, there was a magnificent outcome at the Bali Ministerial. There was agreement to a new trade facilitation agreement and a decision on public stock holding. Then 2 years later in Nairobi, and I again was there with Ambassador Froman, and updating of that decision. You know, an ideal scenario would be that there are new negotiations in the WTO on agriculture, because it's a sector that is so critical to so many countries, and domestic support programs are, everybody's got them, and you know, they can distort trade. So a new multilateral negotiation that would address continuing distortions and also help countries find ways to reform their policies
internally, give us an excuse to change.
Yeah, it would be ideal. It's just it's hard. I mean, Geneva is a funny place, and the multilateral system is in a state of evolution. It's at a.
The other people say disarray, and you say evolution. That's nice.
I'm a big believer. So I'm at the Atlantic Council. I'm with the South Asia program, but I'm also working with there's a global economic program, and I'm doing WTO related stuff there because much of my career has been WTO. I'm a big believer in the system, and I also like to point out I love history, and I've always been I've always been intrigued by the history of the multilateral trading system going back to 1947, you know, how the GATT came into being in the years after that, which was a serious crisis when the U.S. Senate did not ratify the International Trade Organization, which had been negotiated in 1947. GATT became the default. There was a crisis in the 70s when during the Tokyo round, when there were big negotiations on new areas, and then the countries couldn't agree whether they would apply to everybody. It was a huge crisis, and they got creative and essentially made them plurilateral results that each country could choose whether to join on. Eventually, those results were multilateralized during the Uruguay round. So this isn't the first crisis. It's a big one. It's you know, the whole appellate body question is you know, is a big one, and so it's a crisis. But I think there are opportunities to bring creativity to this crisis. It was I think Rahm Emanuel when he was chief of staff to President Clinton, who made the point, don't waste a good crisis. And that may be the circumstances we face with WTO.
All right, just a couple more quick questions, then I'll throw it open. Sort of the two big ones. Manish mentioned, talked a little bit about the data issue. And definitely, it seems that we have taken institutionally in this country a particular path, depending upon judging by various. It's not just one, the draft e-commerce policy. It's the draft privacy policy. A bunch of other things have action from the Reserve Bank of India on payments architectures and so on and so forth. All have focused on this notion that a certain amount of data must be within the country, must be kept within the country. Now, I mean, full disclosure, I personally don't believe this is a good idea. But it seems to be a gathering consensus within India, and one for which, oddly, we are getting, a certain amount of support from various quarters, including academic quarters. Um, to what degree is this really? This is a new area. The pressure groups haven't, really formed themselves effectively. I think everywhere. To what degree could a crisis in this completely new field hold back progress in the legacy areas on trade?
I hope not. And there is some possibility of that.
Is there some way to detach it, to decouple the two areas?
Well, it's there's
I mean, we argue it's already decoupled, but
yeah. I mean,
technically-
the measures aren't in place yet. I mean, there was the RBI action last year, but the measures aren't in place yet. There, appears to be the opportunity for commentary, consultation, efforts to mold that policy in certain ways before it's a final one, which I understand won't be until after the election.
at least 6 to 8 months, if not longer.
Yeah. So ideally, stakeholders without the governments needing to discuss this can work with the Indian government and address some of the concerns and ensure that the policy is the best it can be. And even in the United States, where there's generally been the laissez-faire approach, there are increasing discussions about what might come next, and we're all still learning about how data can be used and misused. So hopefully it doesn't become an issue that the two governments have to engage on a lot, because if it's that circumstance, unfortunately, I think it could be a very tense one. So I'm hoping that can be avoided.
And finally, I mean, this is sort of a larger question for you. Now, you've been in this world now for a long time, and I think it's fair to say that 20 to 25 years ago, a bargain was struck. And the bargain was that the People's Republic of China will become a member of the international trading architecture. And in return, it'll carry out various sorts of reforms back home. And I think if you'd gone back to those who were striking that deal 20 or 25 years ago and told them 25 years from now, it'll still be a relatively opaque structure. You still won't know who's subsidizing what. You still won't have that. Crucially, you won't have free finance, so without free finance, you can never really track down what subsidies look like. And worst of all, the implicit political bargain, that China will therefore become a freer society domestically and a more responsible player abroad. That one definitely has not been followed up on. Was it a bad bargain?
Very good question. I will start to answer it by noting. Well, we all know that that hindsight
is
makes
20/20,
all the
yeah.
difference
Yeah.
in the world. And just in terms of kind of a parallel, very big question about in multilaterally. Was the Doha round a mistake? And in retrospect, I think it was. I think it didn't fully anticipate how the organization had changed from the old GATT days and whether that kind of approach would work. Clearly, the negotiators on China accession, I know many of them, didn't anticipate this circumstance. Maybe they couldn't have anticipated.
It's difficult. I mean, and I don't think you can blame them.
But China is unique. The existing rules really didn't work, and that's why there now is such an intense effort with China bilaterally between the U.S. and China, with a lot of support from so many other countries.
Yes, I mean, in the September, I think of the sidelines of the UNGA, there was the Japanese, the Europeans, and the US released, I think, a discussion about, among other things, WTO reform, like a short paper.
Exactly.
And a short note, which without, I don't even know if China was mentioned explicitly.
It wasn't.
Yes, but it was to anyone reading it, it was very clear that these are a sequence of issues that have to do with China, with disruptions that they believe that China has forced on the global trading regime. So I will now ask you a follow-up to that, which is that on what you said in that paper and what was said in that paper by the three maybe largest developed world trading blocs, a lot of people in New Delhi would agree. But I think there was also concern here that A, we weren't reached out to, and B, anything that frames this as China is no longer a developing country and therefore shouldn't get the benefits that developing countries do, that we're not okay with. Because then that comes back and hits us. So in some sense, wouldn't it be easier to reach out to maybe, let's say, other stakeholders, if you're trying to put together a larger perspective on this?
Yes.
Okay, good. That clearly.
No, and I think that's I assume that's the goal, and I haven't done WTO for some time, that this was all meant to prompt potentially a negotiation in the WTO that can address those kinds of problems and would involve all the countries that care about this, including India.
Well, I think that the truth is that whatever one may say that the current administration is a bit of an outlier in some respects, but I think that the one place where it is not an outlier is in both domestically and in terms of the current of opinion globally, is in thinking that something needs to be done about a trading system that is in many ways being distorted by the Chinese presence at this point. And I think I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say about that. So I will now throw it open. Are there any questions? Because if there aren't any immediately, I have a couple of further follow-ups that I need to go with. But yeah. Please do introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Nivedita Mukherjee. I'm a senior journalist and currently freelancing. I'm a specialist in international trade relations. How far do you think, President Trump's putting America first has kind of delivered for the U.S. economically? And there's a lot of talk about India being able to leverage very strongly on the ongoing tariff war between U.S. and China. What's your take on that?
Frankly, I think it's too early to tell. We're 2 years into this administration, and I'm not an economist, certainly by profession or expertise, but there's got to be some lag time in terms of GDP results and policies. So I think it's probably too early to tell what the exact impact is. But looking specifically to the example we were just discussing, China, it was hardball tactics, which aroused lots of reasonable questions. But so far, it's working in the sense that China is actually actively negotiating with the United States on these fundamental questions. So in that space, there's certainly been an impact. It's not clear what the outcome will be yet.
You have some experience, I'm sure, with Chinese negotiating. Is there a sense? Do they even somewhere? Is there a sense that they share this notion that maybe they have gotten more out of the system than other people have, and so there is obviously going to be a pushback, or is it just that okay?
I would predict that China will make very active efforts to seek that the rules, any new rules, aren't too hard on them.
No, I mean that's natural. But
That is natural.
but I
so-
mean, are
and,
they in some sense? What I'm asking is, do. And it's always tough to do with negotiators in the People's Republic because you never know to what extent, but will it be just an imposition of, okay, these are the rules and we can get away with it? Or will it just be this, is there a genuine sense of, do they not understand the genuine sense of grievance that maybe their interlocutors have?
I expect they understand that there's a sense that there's grievance, whether it's justified or not. They probably question. I mean, there have been moments. I think WTO accession was one of those in which the Chinese government saw an opportunity to introduce some much needed
Reform
reforms.
domestically, yeah.
And
used it as an
Exactly.
as a stick with which to beat their own domestic interest groups.
Exactly. But right now, that doesn't seem to be a dynamic. So,
Because they may have their own other more effective sticks at the moment.
yeah.
All right. Any further questions? If there aren't any, then I have one that I had held.
Imagine that you haven't run out.
I have one more, which is, and then maybe we could break. But one more, which is about the use of national security. You're out in the world now. These are things that you're going to, not only are you going to get asked, but you're going to have to you'll have a via media, I'm sure, with how to.
But I'm only 3 months out.
So the use of national security as a reason for trade action. Now, is this something that we're going to look at more often in the future? Is it something that we're going to see other players doing as well? And where does that leave the WTO? Because this is essentially something that it's difficult for the current system to handle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be careful with this, but there are big risks, and one of those central risks is the current WTO disputes that are ongoing, and whether a panel is going to make a decision on what is national security and what is not.
Which is, I mean, from a sovereign nation's point of view, would be absurd. But then on the other hand, if it's being used to infringe on trade, then it's a really problematic issue. And I'm maybe it's just as well that it came out into the open, because I'm not sure if there is an answer that we have.
I mean, I will leave it at. I mean, there are serious risks to using national security as a reason for imposing.
But
restrictions.
let's say tomorrow, if okay, let me play devil's advocate, maybe from, let's say, the PRC's point of view. You're saying that it's risky to impose trade restrictions from the national security point of view. but everyone is going out and arguing that Huawei is a national security risk and imposing trade restrictions on that basis. So in effect, national security is already a reason to impose trade restrictions, is it not, sir?
Well, I mean, there are, provisions in the original GATT that provide for it. So, I mean, the founding document anticipates that
That this would be an issue.
and that there might be the need for that. So,
But in some sense, we can instinctively understand that, yes, it is possible that your telecom infrastructure is a question of national security, but being self-sufficient in steel and aluminum is not. But even if we can instinctively understand this, it's difficult to make an argument, a legal argument, that one is and one is not. I mean,
yeah, and frankly, that's an area I won't venture into now, just because, mainly because it's, I mean, certainly a sensitive issue, but mainly because it's a complicated one too, and I wouldn't want to express views without feeling like
yeah, you're not going deeply enough into it, but
yeah, exactly.
But a yes or no,
Done the research, really thought about
a yes or no question, in your opinion, is the current WTO architecture capable of handling this question?
I certainly think that most WTO members would hope that it's not done through dispute settlement. That there are dangers
To doing it through the dispute settlement mechanism, because
because there may be decisions that many regret in terms of defining national security in this context.
Excellent. I think that's absolutely fair. Unless there are further questions about the trade relationship, I'm going to thank you very much, and I'm going to, as promised, let you go 15 minutes early. And thank you very much for coming here, and I hope to see you again. And I hope that we will have a long and productive relationship now that you're doing something special with the Atlantic Council.
Yeah, it's fun.
Thank you on behalf of ORF, and thank you all for coming.